There we go. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the last of our four online sessions that form this year's MaaS Scotland annual conference. Many thanks for taking the time to join us this morning, and in particular to those who are joining us perhaps for the second, third, or even fourth time. Your engagement with the event is very much appreciated. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping, although I know that you'll all know the drill by now, but you'll notice that you have all been put on mute, and we would ask you to keep it that way for the duration of the session. It's probably also a good idea to keep the cameras off as well, just in the interests of bandwidth. That said, although we're keeping you on silent, we do want this session to be as interactive as possible. So, and we would encourage you to use the chat functionality to introduce yourselves, to make contacts within the participants, and obviously to post any comments and questions that you might have as well. So welcome to today's session, where we're going to be exploring the role of MaaS in supporting a more sustainable transport future. Previous sessions at this conference have focused on, I guess, particular areas. We've had sessions on the project landscape in Scotland. We've had sessions on behavioural change and on governance. But this session is designed to be slightly wider, a kind of more holistic discussion, I guess, on our future ambitions for the transport sector, with a particular emphasis on decarbonisation. Just very briefly, again, as I have done in previous sessions, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Cubic IBI and Enterprise, for their support of this event, both this year and last, and also to our corporate sponsors, Enigma, People Solutions and Scintilla, who provide support to Technology Scotland across all its networks, and for an organisation like ours, that really is very important. So we're grateful to all of those organisations for their continued support. Just very briefly about us, MaaS Scotland, this is, were formed in 2017, and we were, I guess, formed to be the focal point of MaaS activities in Scotland, to facilitate initiatives that will help to deliver the benefits of MaaS to Scotland. We're now over 75 public and private sector organisations from right across the MaaS supply chain, from technology providers to local authorities and RTPs. And that does make us, as we like to say continuously, one of the largest networks of our kind in the world. As well as having that network of participants, we also have a strong focus on project facilitation, because we see that as being absolutely crucial to generating the evidence base for the positive impact that we hope MaaS can make in Scotland. And primarily that's been through the MaaS Investment Fund, which is now supporting 4 projects across Scotland, looking at MaaS in different use cases and in different geographical locations. But alongside those projects, there's a whole series of discussions that are ongoing as well with stakeholders around what other enablers need to be in place to help deliver an upscale MaaS in future in Scotland. And that takes us down the line of things like governance, obviously, policy, but into things like user behaviour as well, and connectivity, among many other things. And the hope is that by having this project landscape, but also by having these discussions around how we need to enable MaaS in future, that we can begin to position Scotland as a global lead in MaaS development, and indeed a testbed for projects. Okay, so that brings us on to this year's conference, and as those of you who have joined previous sessions will know, we're building this year's conference around the COP26 focus with the event coming to Glasgow in now just a few weeks' time. And that event is going to throw the UK and Scotland and Glasgow, indeed, in particular, into international focus, where we will be for a 10-day period. We will be the centre of global discussions around tackling the climate emergency. So we feel that what better opportunity to place greater emphasis on our own net zero targets and the strategic framework that's going to allow us to get there. And as we all know, transport has to be a key component of that strategic framework. It's well recognised that transport is now the largest or the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions as a sector in Scotland. And while the contribution from other sectors like agriculture and manufacturing more generally is dropping, in transport it remains relatively flat. So it's clear that if we're going to meet those net zero targets by 2045, then we're going to have to make significant inroads into the contribution that transport is making to that. And we know we're not that there's going to have to be a whole series, a whole toolkit, if you like, of solutions and responses, technological, cultural, and political. But we firmly believe that MaaS will be a key component of that. But it's that sort of that holistic view when I talk about that political, cultural, technological approach. It's that holistic view and that range of solutions and challenges that we want to delve into today, but with of course an emphasis on where MaaS can play its role. So that's going to take us back into areas like governance and behavioural change for sure, but also into areas like community engagement, just transition, decarbonisation of our rural areas, investment, and many others. So it's going to be quite a wide-ranging discussion. And I appreciate that is a lot to take on in a single session. And so for that reason, among others, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts who are going to help us navigate through some of these considerations and complexities. So just briefly to run through the agenda, I'm going to kick off in just a minute from a presentation from Andy Kerr, the UK and Ireland lead at the EIT Climate Kick, and then we'll move straight on to our panel session. And we have 5 panelists to help us discuss some of the elements that I spoke about in these opening remarks. And the major part of that will be an interactive, hopefully an interactive Q&A, which will be an opportunity for you guys at home or in your offices to get involved. And we really encourage you to do that through the chat function. Ask your questions, put in your comments to our panelists as they're speaking, and we'll hopefully have plenty of time to answer most, or certainly vast majority of those questions. Okay, before we start, and much like in previous sessions, if you've been at them, you'll know that I do like to kick things off with a poll, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this session today. So the question I'm about to ask you is quite a general one, and I appreciate that I'm also forcing you to pick a particular answer, but that is kind of quite deliberate. So the question that I'm asking is, what do you think will be crucially the lead driver of a more sustainable transport future in Scotland? Now, I know you want it's all of these, right? But I'm going to force you to pick one. So is it, and I'll talk you through it, are advances in technology and innovative delivery models, is that going to be the key for us? Is that going to be the big thing? Or actually, is it less about the technology and is it more about strong government leadership backed by clear policy objectives? Is it even simpler than that? Is it just legislation? Do we just need to force the issue through a legislative process? Or is it more about bringing everybody with us? Is it more about that national community engagement to get buy-in at a national level to our overall objectives relating to net zero and where people can contribute their part? Is it a problem that we can throw money at? And really what it really comes down to is we just need to invest heavily in it. Or is it something else entirely? And if it is something else, then please do put in other. And if you do select other, I would ask if you could then put that into the chat box, if you could let us know what that other might be in terms of what we might miss. So I can see some results already coming through. I'll wait until we've got a few more participants. If we can hit that magic 80% mark, that's always good and always fine. But there seems to be 2 that are kind of leading the way a little bit on this. And that is around strong government leadership and clear policy objectives, but also that idea of that collective engagement, that national engagement, and making sure that everybody buys into those objectives. I think that's quite interesting. Very interestingly, considering this is a MaaS conference and we are all at least sort of technically aware and minded that technology and innovation seen as being further down that list in terms of what's going to drive that. I think that's interesting. And even investment, actually, to a certain extent, is not seen as being as high either. So I think both of these are quite interesting points. So I'll just end that and hopefully I will be able to share those results. So that's the results of that little poll. And that's really just just a little icebreaker to sort of get the feel for where people are coming from in this. But I think it does set the scene quite nicely, perhaps, for some of the questions that we're going to discuss later on, where we will, I think, have a focus, particularly on that national community engagement piece, but amongst those other things as well. So thanks everybody for taking part in that. Okay, let me just put that away now. Okay, so that is more than enough for me, I suspect. So we're now ready to move on to our first speaker. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Andy Kerr. He's the UK and Ireland lead at the EIT Climate Kick. So Andy, can I pass over to you?
Thanks very much, Ali. I will also share my screen because I've got a few slides If you can just let me know whether you can see that. Not come up yet?
We are seeing it, but we're in your PowerPoint view at the moment rather than the slide.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So thank you, Ali. That was a really good little icebreaker because it very much brings up some of the issues you've got. I have to say I'm very excited to be back in an office for the second time in 18 months, but it does mean there's a wee bit of background noise, so apologies for that, but hopefully you will be able to hear me. As Ali has said, my name is Andy Kerr. I lead the activities of Climate Kick, which is one of Europe's largest innovation partnerships for climate action. I'm always very conscious at these MaaS events that I'm not a transport specialist. So what I want to do is talk about how can MaaS support a sustainable transport future, and the context within which I'm bringing this forward is very much the work that we as Climate Kick have been doing to support cities and regions to do the how to deliver really ambitious climate net zero, climate resilience targets. So trying to get to net zero by 2030. And as part of that, we've recently, or we are launching this month, the platform that is supporting the Net Zero Cities platform that's supporting the EU Cities mission, which is trying to get 100 cities to being climate neutral and smart by 2030. So that's the sort of aspiration that we're seeing across Europe. And we've been working with the likes of Edinburgh, some work with Glasgow in this type of space as well. And I'm very conscious that that what I've been talking about is very much on the urban side, and I will come back to some of the issues from the rural side as well. But the key point being that I'm coming at it from transport as a whole system perspective rather than from transport in itself. So as part of the wider context of moving people and goods in and around cities, urban areas, and between cities and urban areas. When we're looking at this whole piece, this wider piece, our experience has really taught us that when we're dealing with cities looking to try and to get to net zero in 10 years, in 15 years, then there are three sort of key building blocks that need to be in place. And they pick up some of the points that Ali's poll went through. One is around placemaking, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a moment. Secondly is how do we pay for it? And thirdly is what I've put as civic legitimacy. And I'll come back to each of those in a bit more detail. If we look at the investment side, what is very clear is that we cannot do this sorts of transformation, the literally upgrading every building, every bit of transport infrastructure and so on in 10 years. We cannot do that with public sector budgets alone. And we can't do it when we've got a mindset, which is, if you like, an annual budget mindset. This has to be done by looking at what we need to do over 10, 15 years. What is the vision of what we're trying to achieve? And work out what the investment is required to make that happen. And it's that investment mindset that says we need to invest this amount of finance into that space. And then we will see a whole series of long-term, what I've called annuity benefits that are coming back. So these are the benefits that might be jobs, there may be skills, there may be green spaces, there may be warm, affordable buildings, homes, and so on. So it's pulling that sort of mindset of we need to look in the 10, 15 year framework to actually make this happen. And we've got to blend public and private finance to make it happen. It cannot be done just by the public sector alone, but it will deliver a whole series of benefits that come through from that. The second piece is this one on placemaking, and whether you call it whole system innovation or whether you call it holistic programs, it's very much about saying that in our experience, you cannot solve for climate only by focusing on climate. You've actually got to focus on the place. You've got to focus on the homes. Are they warm, affordable homes? Have you got jobs? What are the skills that are needed? What's the well-being? Have we got green spaces? In other words, the co-benefits of delivering the climate action is as important as the actual emission reduction bits that go with it. And the third piece is around this civic legitimacy piece, which is simply a fancy way of saying that we cannot do this to communities. This has to be done with communities. It has to be done with consent, and more than consent, it has to be done with enthusiasm. In other words, we have to build a shared vision for how we're going to deliver this. And if we get all of that right, then what we should get is both a lot of investment into these spaces, a lot of the co-benefits of climate action, whether you call them in the spillover benefits or whatever, but it's very much picking up the fact that increasingly we're looking for integrated personalized services. And obviously there's a link back to some of the thinking within the MaaS community in that space. And then on the civic legitimacy point, it's about increased agency, resilience to future economic environmental shocks, and so on. Now, the reason I wanted to sort of bring this very high level point is that if these are the building blocks that allow us to get to the where we want to go, I hope you can start to make the connection between some of the thinking that's going on with MaaS in terms of that personalized services, in terms of the spillover benefits and so on that come from these types of underpinning elements to how we'd shift a whole system, a city, a town, a region, a series of villages, and how we move that down the track towards net zero in 10 or 15 or 20 years. Now, just focusing in a bit on a place, it's worth saying that we've heard a lot about placemaking, we've heard a lot about 20-minute neighbourhoods, and indeed the programme for government in 2020 in Scotland committed the Scottish Government to working with local government and other partners to take forward the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods. But we shouldn't sort of be hamstrung by sloppy thinking in this space. The essence of the idea is how do we ensure that citizens can access day-to-day needs, services, amenities, green space within a short trip from home, whether it's by wheelchair, by walking, by bicycling, by public transport. And it's very much trying to reallocate urban space away from cars to other modes and improve community and individual well-being. And so this neighbourhood concept usefully pulls together a wide range of relevant services, infrastructure. We would add more on top of that, not just the services, but thinking about the buildings as well, the quality of the buildings, so that you're empowering these place communities to focus on meeting their daily needs. What are the levers of change that sit behind this? Well, I've already talked about the sort of the upper three, if you like, the finance and investment, placemaking, the civic legitimacy. I'll leave aside supply chains for this talk. The other things that we are seeing that come through in this conversation, this debate, is very much around the education and skills on the left. But the other two underpinning things that come through is this desire to electrify everything. And particularly when we come to transport and indeed a lot of the buildings work in urban environments, at least, how do we electrify things? But the other one is that underpinning need for data and effective metrics, effective understanding of what it is we are trying to assess, what are we measuring? And so while there's a lot of support for the notion of well-served neighbourhoods in Scotland, and these are obviously very differently expressed whether you're in a dense urban environment or in a rural community. It's apparent that the services and the infrastructure that we need to deliver that are not yet of the required quality. And delivering that does require much more people-centered development with stakeholders in each local community. But it also requires those national frameworks, things like the fourth MPF, the National Planning Framework, to rationalise and coordinate policy landscape to support delivery. So there is a challenge within Scotland in the sense that while many people agree this is a good thing to do, in practice, many of the, if you like, the proposed revolutions in local public service delivery or provision in Scotland that have embraced sort of similar core aims have actually not been delivered effectively. And so the real issue about delivery. But this role of placemaking becomes absolutely crucial in meeting these really ambitious climate targets. And it reflects the experience of public bodies, public authorities internationally, that you cannot focus by sector. You cannot take transport independently of buildings. You can't take that independently of green spaces. You actually have to look, and you can't just do it as a technical fix. You actually have to bring them together in a space and focus on what the people, on people's needs in that space. And so this focus on placemaking is very much on prioritizing the quality of life and well-being. So if that's the sort of context, let me just give you 2 or 3 examples to finish and really try and set up the discussion with our excellent panel. One thing to say then is, as an example, Edinburgh is proposing to use the 20-minute neighbourhood model to frame local development as part of their net zero by 2030 ambitions. So it's very much about creating that environment within which we can look at not just the normal communities, but actually a number of communities across the city that naturally feed together to deliver this. And the sorts of things that they're thinking about in terms of building this, one is about creating shared stories of place. In other words, what does this mean? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each place? Who are the community councils, the neighborhood networks? Who are the businesses that are operating in that space? It's about building on early opportunities that are happening. It's very much about the services rather than the physical infrastructure initially. It's about realigning resources. It's trying to bring everything together into that space, realigned around the people in that place. And at the heart of that then is also the businesses that sit behind that and the business liaison. So you can start to see how they're building this model as a means of delivering these radical transformative climate targets. But it obviously plays into a critical issue in terms of the thinking that MaaS is bringing to the table as well. The second one is just to flag again, quite recently, Glasgow launched its 30 billion investment prospectus, which again looks at various both transport, building initiatives, investment needs to try and make that move towards net zero, but also looking at some of the networks of active travel infrastructure it's trying to bring. And again, it's just looking at this space as being an opportunity for rethinking how we see place and therefore the transport and the mobility that comes behind it. And the third thing I just want to flag in my last couple of minutes is I don't normally talk about tech very much because generally the issue that we're facing when we're trying to change whole cities or whole regions is not actually in the individual tech. It is the governance, it's the investment, it's the civic engagement. But we are also seeing new markets developing. And here are 3 examples. Lilium, I've put up simply because we supported them in their early days. So this is a vertical takeoff electric run taxi, vertical takeoff and landing taxi, which has just launched on the NASDAQ exchange last month. My levels is not yet at that stage, but it's just to flag the sorts of changes we are seeing in wearable tech. So that's looking at basically increasingly, well, from my view, intrusive measurement of individuals. So my levels is looking at sugar for glucose for diabetes and so on, just with wearable tech, telling you exactly how you're doing at any moment of the day and what you should be eating and so on. We're seeing increasing amounts of that. So that whole notion of wearable tech and people increasingly focused on their own personal well-being. And NatureQuant is an American startup which is looking at actually how you bring together all these data streams to tell people exactly what the environment is like where they are, in terms of air quality, access to green space and so on. These are the sorts of directions that we're seeing for technologies at the moment, which are going to be disruptive going forward. It's just to keep in mind when we're talking about the sorts of changes we might see over the next 5-10 years. So let me finish with just some questions really for you, and really just to try and open it up for the panelists. And the question really is, what does success look like? What does MaaS look like if it has been successful in 10 years or in 15 years? What's your 10-year vision for MaaS? What does it mean for the behaviors at a community level as much as at an individual level? And what's the policy and governance frameworks around that we would need to see to make that happen? We're starting to see it in Scotland as people orientate around things like 20-minute neighbourhoods. But what does that mean for the rural environment, for example? And just a couple of thoughts at the end. This isn't just about EVs, it's also about modal shift. We do need to remind ourselves of the rural versus the urban experiences and the needs and what that means. And finally, just think about some of the changes that we're seeing in the technologies and what that means for both us as individuals, but also at a community level. So hopefully that's just thrown a few ideas up in the air to give you some thinking about where we might be going at a sort of city and region level to deliver these targets. And I look forward to hearing the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. And I think that was the kind of perfect framing of the rest of this morning's discussion, because I think we are going to touch on a number of areas that you highlighted there, and indeed some of the questions that you posed to us at the end there as well. So looking forward to getting stuck into that later on. Okay, so we are now about to move on to our panel session. And first up on the panel, it made sense, since this is this event is broadly built around COP26, it made sense that we would kick off the panel session with a representative from the host city. So we're absolutely delighted to have with us Councillor Anna Richardson, who is the City Convener for Sustainability and Carbon Reduction. So Anna, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much for that. And hopefully my remarks today will follow on from that previous presentation fairly seamlessly. Thanks a lot for having me in this session. I'm delighted to be here to represent Glasgow. And I'm just going to make some brief remarks today around some of the issues that we have to take into account as we look ahead to the next decade in transport as a local authority. Glasgow, as many will be aware, has committed to reaching net zero carbon by 2030, which is a tough target, but I think it's one that we have to achieve, and transport emissions will need bold action to make significant reductions. So we're currently developing our 10-year transport strategy. Part of that is out for consultation as of next week. And we'll seek not only to decarbonise transport, but also to address existing inequalities across the city, where transport is hindering equal access to work, to education, or to services. And we're committed to investing in improved bus infrastructure with Scottish Government funding over the next 5 years. And of course, have taken forward the longer term metro project for Glasgow. Through our bus partnership, we will expect bus operators to bring forward the improvements that passengers are demanding, with more seamless ticketing, for example, or more coordinated routing. And the low emission zone in the city centre is already reducing air pollution, with cleaner buses already in the fleet. And by 2023, all other vehicle types will be expected to comply, which will contribute to modal shift in the city centre as well as cleaner air. And we're playing our part as a council to support the electrification of vehicles, and we're also decarbonising our own council fleet ahead of 2030. This is an important part of the jigsaw, but I think, as we've already heard, it's not going to be enough on its own. And it will come as no surprise to anyone here that if we're serious about making a shift to sustainable transport, we have some very big decisions ahead about how we use our road space and the actions that we will need to take to significantly reduce car journeys while increasing connectivity for our communities. The density of population that offers cities like Glasgow an opportunity to become sustainable places to live requires us to treat our roads as the precious commodities that they are, and to identify transport solutions that bring the greatest value from that public space. So we're about to launch next week a consultation on our new active travel strategy that was introduced there by Andy, and our proposed city network, which will require approximately 270 kilometres of cycle lanes to be built by 2030. That's a huge task, but it's one that we feel confident about working to deliver, especially following the lessons that we learned from our COVID-related Spaces for People project that built pop-up lanes and created more public space across the city for people walking, cycling and wheeling. Many of those temporary installations are now being made permanent and form the beginning of that city network. And in conjunction with that strategy, we are working on our Livable Neighbourhoods plan, our response to the 20-minute neighbourhood idea. And the entire city will be covered by that plan between now and 2030. Again, a huge task. And we intend to give residential streets back to people to walk, cycle, wheel, play and reconnect with one another through that programme. Again, we are talking about a significant shift in the pace and scale at which we need to transform our city, but it's going to be critical if we're going to achieve that net zero target. And at the heart of all of this work, we need to remember that almost half of Glasgow's households don't have access to a car. So the streets we have that have for so long prioritised car use have never worked for us all, and that has to change. It's essential that we focus our efforts on the communities who don't have good transport links already and increase their transport infrastructure in climate-friendly ways. And again, I would refer back to the previous presentation. It's these other aspects of this climate action that is so crucial and will get the support and buy-in that we need. So we will need to have a mixture of public transport, of bike and car share schemes, of safer streets that enable active travel, and better planning of housing and amenities to minimise some of that need to travel. I believe if we get this right, the benefits of a just transition to a carbon neutral city will be there for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. It's really interesting to get the city perspective, particularly one that's going to be, as I say, global focus of such discussions going forward. But encouraging to hear so many ambitious plans going forward. And I think also it highlights that there's no single solution here. It's going to be a toolkit of solutions that are going to have to be applied across not just our cities but our rural areas as well. So that was an excellent starting point for the panel discussion, so thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our second panelist, and confusingly that is another Anna, so that's going to be the Q&A interesting later. But the next second panelist is Anna Allwright of Cubic Transportation Systems. So Anna, over to you, and I believe you are going to share some slides with us as well.
Yeah, I will, thanks. Still saying disabled.
That should be you now, and I think maybe because you dropped off the meeting earlier on, but hopefully we'll be okay now.
No worries. Can you see that now?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, I'm Anna Allwright. I'm a strategy specialist at Cubic Transportation Systems. In case you're not aware of Cubic, for almost the last half century, we've been partnering with cities, transport authorities and agencies to find solutions to manage congestion, make our transport system safer, more efficient, and empower travelers to have more seamless journeys. We are really strong believers that efficient transport is critical to the health of our cities. And when I say efficient, energy efficient is just one part of the puzzle. Growing powers of urbanization and population growth are going to increasingly put pressure on our networks. And I think focusing just on climate and having climate-only policies is going to be to our detriment. I think when we have policies, we need to have people-focused policies. And for transport, that means how do we tackle congestion? How do we tackle air pollution? How do we get valuable road space back? And this is why I'm a firm believer that every transport policy really is a climate policy. It's a congestion policy. I think that often when we talk about climate change targets, electric vehicles have been front and center of the conversation. But realistically, even if every car was an electric vehicle, we still have car-dependent cities. And this takes away really valuable road space from other initiatives like bus rapid transit, cycle lanes, wider pedestrian footpaths. So strategies to end our car dependency are becoming increasingly important. After coronavirus, an MIT study showed that people valued their car 3 times more after the pandemic than they did before. And this is creating a pattern where car driving is becoming rebounding quicker than public transport use. So if we want to make our networks cleaner, we're going to need to make them work more efficiently overall. And building transport-oriented cities is really key to do this. So how do we make our networks less car dependent? We really need to be focusing on strategies that make public transport a realistic alternative. For too long, cars have been realistically the most easy form of transport. They pick you up at your door, they take you to where you want to go, you never have to wait. We can't realistically ask people all the time to make a climate focused decision. If we do that, then realistically some people, a small percentage, might make the greener choice, but that reduced demand will just be filled almost instantly by people who don't care as much. So we really need to focus on making sure the greenest solutions are also the easiest solutions for people to take. And what does this mean for the transport industry? It means looking at ways to make our public transport journeys equal time to a car journey. And that can be through managing our network better, through using intersections to prioritize public transport vehicles. It also means empowering people with travel information. So knowing when their services are going to arrive, so they're not stuck waiting at a bus stop or an interchange. We need to make sure it's easy and seamless to pay and plan and book. And this is why interoperability and integration is going to be such an important component. And this is why MaaS is such a key enabler of making our transport systems more efficient through making them more efficient overall. We also need to make sure public transport is affordable, not just for someone like me, but also for a family of 5. And a big component of that is going to be making the operations more affordable in the back end. And that's another place where integration and data sharing is going to be key. If we keep managing different modes in silos, we're going to really struggle to optimize the way we're using the network and effectively manage demand. And it's not just demand for public transport, it's also how we're using microtransit to support first mile, last mile. And this is, really important for urban environments, but also in rural environments where, at the moment they are more car dependent. And as we look into the future and how we're going to fund our public transport systems, vehicle kilometers traveled is, a strategy that's really being focused on. And at the moment, that's not going to be an equitable solution for our rural communities. So we need to make sure that they're being connected to our transport hubs the same way that urban environments are. And then we also need to look at, there are always going to be people who drive. How do we make this a less attractive option? And how do we make sure we're bringing the externalities of driving back into our network through road user charging, low emission zones, and congestion zones? Things like account-based ticketing and MaaS and road user charging and congestion management are all great solutions individually. But if we keep doing these solutions as a piecemeal approach, we're going to really struggle to see the outcomes that we've hoped for. I think there's a really clear role for our public agencies and cities to create a really clear roadmap for mobility transformation. We need to have a more strategic approach to planning and procurement so that these solutions aren't just going to be one technology implemented to try and fight climate change, but it's going to be a holistic approach where everything is working together to not just, help us meet our climate targets, but also to help make our cities safer, more sustainable, more equitable, and healthier overall. And this sort of roadmap and cohesive approach is going to be really important to getting public support behind us because, transport has typically struggled a little bit to get public support behind a lot of their major projects. And this is why we really need to be able to communicate, not just make this choice for climate change, but make this choice because it's going to make your life easier and put it in those terms. And I think that's going to be really important in helping us meet our climate targets. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks Anna. And I think you highlighted there as well a couple of things that one, this that we can't be over reliant on the electrification of the fleet for the reasons that you mentioned, that ultimately we have to move away from that car dependency. But I think also you highlighted nicely where MaaS can help to do that, not just in terms of incentivizing people to perhaps shift modes, but also a way of making the modes that they will be shifting to more efficient and therefore more attractive. So I thought that was excellent. Okay, on to our third panelist this morning, and that is Professor Maria Cavagiani, who is the Professor of Transport Systems of Innovation Sustainability at UCL. So Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Ali. Good morning, everybody. So our university, UCL, does a lot of work and campaigns on COP26 and net zero. And we have recently published an explainer about how we can transit to this new era. So we all know that transport, we blame transport for the emissions and greenhouse gas emissions for their impact on the environment. But why is this the case? We have the biggest issue is on the supply side and on the technologies that we use in the transport sector. In several locations, in several places, and not only in the UK, we use quite old and updated technologies that emit a lot of emissions, and their impact on the environment is huge. So we need to update and our infrastructure and of course our fleet. If we do not move to an electrified fleet, to electric vehicles, then whatever we are going to do, it's quite difficult to achieve net zero. Of course, then transport is an ecosystem, and all the actors should be involved in this effort, in applying the new technologies that can contribute to net zero. We have to involve all the actors, the operators, the authorities, the technology providers, and of course the citizens, in order to be able to bring them at the right stage at the same time. It is really important to provide incentives to the technology providers and also the demand side about electrification. In a study that we did in London a few years back, where we explored the vehicle purchase behavior of Londoners, we identified that the monetary incentives come second. The most important incentive for them to convince them to shift to electric mobility is to have in place the infrastructure, to have electric vehicle infrastructure in quite widespread and accessible locations, in order the citizens to have peace in mind that they can find a charger and charge their vehicles whenever they need. We associate this a little bit with the anxiety we have with our smartphones not to run out of battery. So this behavior we also identify in the electrification of the fleet. But it is a little bit the chicken and the egg problem, because on the one hand, we have the citizens that are concerned about electric vehicle infrastructure, and on the other hand, we have the supply side that they say that there is not enough demand and our business models are not sustainable. So here we need the support of the authorities and partner all together in order to find solutions for this. And once we achieve these critical aspects in the infrastructure, then new mobility services and concepts, but also public transport and the traditional transport modes can benefit from this. And here comes also the mobility as a service concept, that if we make sure that we have this infrastructure and equipment in place, then MaaS services could use some nudging techniques in order to promote these sustainable transport modes and support citizens to develop a sustainable and ecological travel behavior. And in order to achieve this, of course, education and awareness is also needed. We have to educate both citizens and authorities and industry about the importance of these actions, but also to educate them how to transit to this new reality and how to have a just transition.
Thanks, Maria. And I think it's a really good point there around infrastructure, and perhaps it was remiss of me not to include infrastructure as one of the options on that initial poll that we ran, because I think you're right, without infrastructure in place, be it electric charging or indeed the public transport infrastructure to allow people to make these changes, then it's going to be more difficult. And I think the fact that you mentioned in your own research that having the infrastructure in place was more of an incentive than perhaps the cost to switch to electric vehicles, I think is a really interesting point as well. Much to touch on later on, but we'll move on now to our fourth speaker, who is Graham Scott, who is, as well as being director of IBI Group, he is also the chair of MaaS Scotland. So we're part of the same team, hence the reason we're both wearing check shirts this morning, I think. Yeah, excellent. So Graham, over to you.
Thanks, Ali, and we did get the memo. So yeah, we're coordinated. It's always a challenge coming on later in one of the panel sessions, because you hope that the previous speakers haven't stolen all the points you were going to make. So I think hopefully what I speak about will complement that, and hopefully I don't steal Laura's thunder coming on last. It's always that real challenge. The simple answer to the question for the session is MaaS absolutely should be a key part, not just supporting, but at the heart of a sustainable transport future. You know, if you break down MaaS into its key components, you get information, booking, payment for a range of modes, all in a joined up fashion. Yeah, simple. That's it. But that's where I've been putting a bit of thought into this. And again, looking at the overall landscape. So that's the idealistic view versus the current reality. And actually going back to the initial poll that you ran, Ali, technology's there. It's there, it's there at the moment, but it needs far more than that to make all of this happen. So what are the challenges and the obstacles that need to be addressed? So again, what does transport look like, or what will it look like in a post-COVID environment? And after the last 18 months, what is the real impact, a permanent impact and changes of how we're functioning? So cities operating differently from a work and retail perspective, and the impact of e-commerce. And having two teens at home, I know about e-commerce a lot in our daily deliveries, and people just living and working differently. So again, the apparent exodus to moving out of the city to the country, people, they're not commuting daily. Now, I'm conscious that a lot of this, what I'll talk about, is largely looking at an urban context. I'm not forgetting rural, but maybe we can pick that up in the questions, but it is time limited. But there's very similar issues and solutions, perhaps exacerbated in the rural environment, which is important in Scotland. But the changes that we've experienced present a lot of challenges. The behaviour is different. The traditional Monday to Friday peaks have gone, and many of the traditional business models that revolve around that have gone as well. And can new models for transport be flexible enough in terms of service delivery or frequency and cost? So some factors in that perspective. Traffic levels, I believe, are largely back to pre-pandemic levels, and people have again become used to using the car. I think more so than perhaps they did beforehand for various concerns during the pandemic. The recently closed ScotRail consultation, which I think is reflective of the wider rail sector, not just in the UK, but certainly worldwide, and possibly more representative of the public transport sector overall. The aspect that kind of concerns me is that future decisions on services are being made on currently anticipated demand and not what the aspirations and vision is for the future. So again, for want of a better word, the potential slashing of off-peak and evening services across the central belt of Scotland, is that going to push people away from public transport? and it will take years, if any, to get that back again. And then the business models, so revenues and subsidies, it takes time to affect behavioural change. And again, I think events over the last 18 months have pushed back many years or more years than that, you know, just quite significant years progress in behavioural change. But, you know, I'll come back to that. So I guess over the last, well, many years, but certainly over the last year, working with colleagues at IBI, we've been doing placemaking and smart city planning work. And we've seen an increasing focus on not just buzzwords, but decarbonisation, electrification, sustainability, net zero, active travel, car free. These are all linked. The investment now in those developments to put the infrastructure in place with a wider softer framework will be an enabler and support that future change. That's great for new developments, but that will take time to come to fruition. What do we do now? What needs to happen in the next 12 to 24 months? COP26 is in the title of the session, and back to that, some of the key publications in the last year, so particularly say the IPCC report and the Code Red for Humanity note in there. So you have to expect that there's going to be very onerous commitments that will be made at the conference to address climate change. Transport is still one of the key contributors to emissions, even with decarbonisation. So we really need to take action now. So I then look at a couple of the political perspectives. Now, from the Scottish Government perspective, the recent announcement on investment commitments in the coming decade to active travel and reduction in road miles is one perspective. But then the Prime Minister's conference speech yesterday, where he noted that transport investment is a key to levelling up. But other than the long overdue Northern Powerhouse Transpennine rail link, most of the other schemes mentioned were about enhancing our roads. You know, major road schemes, the A1 and the A75 were noted. Is that the right focus for major investment to support sustainable and the roadmap to achieving the COP26 declarations? So investment does need to happen, but it needs to be investment in the right fixed infrastructure, such as the active travel networks that Councillor Richardson highlighted. And again, as a Glaswegian, I'm really excited about those. But I think it's more importantly, it's coupled with the investment in mobile infrastructure. So in services, in technology that will ensure the choice, flexibility and affordability. I think that then would be the real leveller, and MaaS is most definitely at the heart of that. So to kind of wrap up, Andy asked, what does success look like? And so my final point, and it actually goes back to how I started in this industry in the first place 25 years ago, was road pricing. Now, decarbonisation will reduce emissions, but it's still going to lead to car traffic, it'll lead to congestion, it leads to inefficiency. Now, Andy also talked about the investment mindset over a longer period. So if we really, truly want the big change and a real transition to sustainable, clean, active transport, it does need those big decisions. So charging to drive such change and achieve the vision, you know, that's where you'll get the revenues to support that change. Stop playing in the margins. You know, if for want of a better phrase, hit the nuclear button. It's not a popularity contest. It's far more than that. I think that's what we need to do to take things forward. And back to you, Ali.
Thank you, Graham. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to immediately move now on to our fifth and final. And you have drawn the short straw a little bit, Laura, I have to be aware of that. Fifth in a panel of 5 is difficult. So apologies for that in advance, but thanks for joining us. It's Laura Holloway, who's the Head of Government and Public Affairs for UK and Ireland Enterprise. So Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. And yes, I think I have slightly drawn the short straw going last, but hopefully we'll have some different points to make, because I suppose maybe what I'll try and do is look at some of the points people have made from the perspective as an operator, rather than maybe someone looking at how to implement the technology or different ideas. So just a bit of background on Enterprise for people who don't know much about us. We are the world's largest private mobility provider. We have around 1.9 million vehicles globally at any one time, and we operate in over 100 countries. We are a little bit different to a lot of other companies because we are still family owned. So that does allow us to make longer term investments in future innovation and technology, and have a slightly longer term view than many other similar kind of operators. And obviously, as I think a lot of people have mentioned, around the kind of transport ecosystem, we really do see our vehicles as part of that shared and sustainable suite of options, and as a viable alternative to a private ownership of a car or another type of vehicle. In the UK, we have everything all the way from a car, a small hatchback, up to a large HGV or refrigerated lorry. And our fleet's over 130,000 vehicles at the moment, and we operate in over 500 locations. So we really are present in almost every part of the UK. So there's been a bit of a discussion already about the kind of urban versus rural argument. And actually, we do see that quite a lot, because we're present in areas that serve all different kinds of communities. So that could be in a city centre, or it could be a part of, say in the Highlands of Scotland, we have locations and branches and car club vehicles, etc., that do serve different kinds of users and different kinds of communities. Typically, our fleet is only 8 to 12 months old. So our fleet is one of the cleanest on the roads. And actually, the vehicles that we have today, because of the way we cycle them, they will be going into the second-hand market. So the vehicles we have today and will continue to have up to 2030 will form the car park that people are using privately, as well as the vehicles when we use them ourselves. In terms of mobility as a service, I think the way that we look at it is that we recognise the key role that the mobility as a service can play, and also we are involved as a mobility service provider to local authorities. We use a platform, and we've actually got a solution which we can maybe talk about a bit later that we've worked with Ali and his team on up in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, called Go High, which is the largest similar pilot going on at the moment anywhere, I believe. So that's quite an interesting example of rural technology. But for us, I suppose the important thing for MaaS is that it cannot just focus on the kind of what we would call a new and shiny solution that people don't know whether they're going to work. They might not be economically viable. They also might not provide the whole range of options that people need. So the inclusion of rental vehicles, that expands the number of users that already can use that service. And we have obviously a large customer base across the UK. But what it also does is it gives that full suite of options to people, so that when they need a vehicle or they need a car, they can find that option on the MaaS platform or in the MaaS service, however it's deployed. But they also don't need to use it all the time. So it's being in the right mode for the right journey, rather than just removing certain options from the ecosystem. The other thing that I think has been spoken about a little bit for us is that looking at those kind of incentives and the uptakes that people that might make people uptake different types of mobility as a service. So for example, things like mobility credits, giving people an incentive to scrap a private vehicle, but don't just let them buy the next best vehicle they can get, which probably will be in itself a higher pollution vehicle down the road in a few years' time. Actually use that to incentivize behaviour change by offering them credits to use on all kinds of shared transport instead. There's a scheme, and I know it's not in Scotland, but there is a scheme at the moment down in Coventry that's a similar pilot of this kind of approach, and we're sort of waiting to see what the data of that shows. But that's the kind of incentive that's going to help people change their behaviour, rather than in a way that suits their lifestyle, rather than almost being pushed down the line for something that they haven't opted to do. A couple of other things that we've been discussing as well is things around the tax system. So at the moment, our taxation system across the UK actually is pretty archaic. It doesn't really account for any of the shared mobility solutions and innovation that lots of people have already discussed on this panel. It really just kind of works on the basis that you've been provided a company car by an employer, but it doesn't actually incentivize other kinds of schemes. And actually, if you use the tax system to incentivize corporate travel behavior change, then I think actually you would make some difference in terms of tackling corporate travel use as well. And then finally, I suppose what we would say is that development aspect, which a lot of people have talked about in terms of placemaking, really does need to be central to a lot of the thinking in certain areas. And that isn't just urban areas as well. That's large residential developments that are outside urban areas or in suburban areas as well, because actually the types of mobility options that are available where you live will determine what you do in terms of having a private vehicle or 2 private vehicles, etc. So really using the planning system and the planning policy framework to put in place something that looks at sustainable mobility will be, I think, pretty important. And also perhaps being a bit more imaginative in terms of how Section 75 is used to drive change in that way through developers as well. And then the final thing I would say, and it has also been touched on already, is that for us, electrification of our fleet is obviously a huge focus. And, you know, I could talk all day about the types of challenges and types of issues and also our thoughts on electrification. But actually, it isn't just about electrifying every private vehicle on the road. We do need to look at alternatives to those private vehicles. And so actually, electrification is a huge opportunity for the kind of decarbonisation of transport, but it isn't the only answer. And I think we do also need to look at how that fits in a wider ecosystem, of which MaaS is one aspect, but we also have other things as well, which we also need to consider. So I think that's probably echoing what a lot of other people have said, but electrification on its own, I don't think will get us where we need to be in terms of the transport system of the future. I think that was probably all I wanted to say, Ali, without repeating a lot of what other people had to say. But yeah, so happy to move on to questions.
No problem, thank you, and apologies again for that final slot there. But okay, so if we can ask all the panelists just to put their cameras back on so we can all see your faces, because we're about to start on the Q&A now. If you do have any questions for our panelists, maybe something that you've heard over the last hour or so that you'd like to question them on, or a comment you want to make, then by all means do put it into the chat. But we'll start with a question I think that has been raised by pretty much everybody, and was one of the areas highlighted in the initial poll. And it's this idea that if to achieve net zero is going to take a massive sort of national change in transport behaviours. I think we all accept that that's the case. So that's going to involve a degree of community engagement in order to do that. I think what Andy referred to as civic legitimacy, which I thought was an excellent term. So, Councillor Richardson, if we could come to you on this one first from the Glasgow City perspective, and you mentioned the ongoing Glasgow review of Glasgow's transportation strategy at the moment as well, which is going out for consultation. Is that community engagement piece and bringing the city of Glasgow and the citizens of Glasgow along with you, is that going to be a key focus of that strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be critical. And I think Andy was making some really good points in his initial presentation, that actually we can't just focus on the decarbonisation of the actions that we take. And I do agree that one of the ways that we get our communities on board is by addressing the direct problems that they're facing right now around everything to do with climate. So whether that's that they can't get to work because the buses don't run at the right times, whether they're struggling with the affordability of transport, there's a whole load of issues there that we can tackle directly through transport that will lead to more sustainable transport, but will also start to improve people's lives. And I think when we do that, when we very consciously couple everything to do with climate right back to the challenges people have in their lives right now, I think we're in a really good place, and I think we've got a better opportunity to engage with them directly. We are really clear in Glasgow that social justice is at the heart of our approach, not just in transport. So while the Glasgow Transport Strategy will look very much at equality, as does the Active Travel Strategy and many other bits of work we're doing in transport, our climate plan for Glasgow also says that the actions we take on climate must not exacerbate inequality. So we've got that running as a theme through everything that we do, and I think that's a real opportunity. And we just have to put our focus on the communities where the transport options haven't been good enough. I'm really lucky in my part of the city. I can walk out my door, I can cycle, I can take the bus, I can take the train, I can use the car that I've got outside my house. I can do all those things very quickly and easily. There are many parts of our city that don't have those options. They maybe have one option and it's simply not good enough, and that's unacceptable. So I'm really keen that we always focus on those communities, that we go to the places where the investment hasn't been made enough in the past, and I think that way we can really get the buy-in from residents and from communities.
Okay, thank you for that. And oh, Andy's disappeared. I was just about to come to you for a question, Andy, and you've disappeared. So maybe I can't. I don't know. He's back. It's fine. Because I mean, Andy, obviously through your work through the KIC, I'd imagine that you're seeing quite a broad view of approaches to this across a number of European cities as part of that. Do you have any examples of where you feel that community engagement is going particularly well? Is there anything that we can learn from what others are doing, or is everybody kind of at a fairly early stage on this?
I think there are a number of cities that are probably a bit further ahead, but I wish I could say that there was some neat way of doing it. The impression we get is that it is always highly contested. It is always hard. You need a lot of political leadership. You've got, and that's where actually the vision, that, you know, clarity of what are you trying to achieve in 10 years time becomes really important. So, you know, the work we've seen in places like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, you know, you can certainly say they're ahead of a lot of the UK or the Scottish cities, but they've done it through a lot of hard work. And it's worth saying that, you know, I look at people that I'm working with in, you know, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in Dundee, in Aberdeen, and they're all going on that journey, and it is hard, you know, and it does need, you know, tough political leadership. It needs a lot of enabling, but I think we are beginning to see the tools that will help communities to get there, and in particular that notion of not just trying to focus on the climate piece, but that much wider benefit that will come to multiple communities if you can get it right. So.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's basically, you know, Copenhagen and Amsterdam are nearly always hailed as being that, and I've always felt that in Scotland we're starting from a different, almost cultural position. You know, where the way that they use transport in Copenhagen and Amsterdam has been normalised over a period of decades, which makes it much easier. Whereas I think in Scotland, and not just Scotland, but other parts of the UK as well, we're a little bit behind that curve. And that takes us on to the education point. Maria, I don't know if you're there because I can see your camera's not on, but Maria, you mentioned the education piece as part of your opening remarks. So if you were there, it'd be great just to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that's going to be a key part of this community engagement exercise.
Could you please repeat, because there is a lot of background noise and I didn't hear.
Sorry, we were just talking about, in terms of that community engagement piece, you mentioned the need for education as part of that. So I was just wanting to expand on that a little bit, about how important that's going to be within our overall sort of objective to try and bring the communities with us on our net zero journey.
It is really important to first of all, to educate all the actors in terms of research. We need some new interdisciplinary approaches. Then we need also to educate authorities, industry, in order how to do this transition. And in all this, to also educate people about the impact and the impact of their behaviors, and engage them in this process. So let's say to have a co-creative and co-designed transition. When we engage citizens in several services or technologies that we design, we get sometimes completely different perspectives, and especially from citizens that belong to vulnerable population groups. So there is need to do this right.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think we can't assume perspectives of the various different stakeholders that you mentioned. But I was in, I've been in a number of similar panel sessions, and there was a nice sort of kind of mantra which I liked, which was around, you have to educate first, then you have to inform by providing information on how people can change their attitudes towards things, and then you have to have the intervention piece where you actually bring in a kind of toolkit of responses to allow people to do that, and that's where obviously government policy or local authority policy can be key. In terms of that, total community engagement, and I'm thinking at a national level now, and Graham, I'm going to come to you on this question first of all, because you were the first to raise it, really. Scotland clearly has a significant rural area, and in order to achieve net zero across Scotland in terms of transport, then we have to be looking at decarbonising our rural areas as much as our urban ones. This is not an easy question because it's extremely difficult, but
thanks.
Where does MaaS have a role to play there, do you think? And I guess, how does it sit alongside other measures that will help us to make sure that this is happening across our communities?
Right. Yeah, it isn't an easy question, and I don't think there is an easy answer either. And I think it's a lot of the rural communities are very poorly served by transport. It's a traditional, you've maybe got a very irregular, say, bus service. There's the rail service is more between key points, the cities, rather than serving the rural communities. I think we did some business case work. I initially around the Cairngorms, and I've looked at other rural areas as well. And part of the challenge is the lack of awareness of what other services are out there. There are a number of community services, but it's people maybe not aware of them. And I think that's the kind of role that MaaS has in bringing those different options together. A word that I've used so many times over the years is silos and siloed thinking. And that's the way a lot of transport measures have been set up. It's just all in silos. And I think now if you look at MaaS, it's not just the conventional transport measures, but you start to bring in active travel, you can bring in car sharing. I heard Laura was talking about kind of car clubs that Enterprise have got. You start to bring all those different elements together and using the technology. And again, with involvement in the HyTrans Go High, and there's other similar developments in the MaaS Investment Fund supported projects in Scotland, you start to provide the platform that make people aware. And that hopefully, when they're aware of what the opportunities and the potential is, it will start to encourage use. And if it encourages use, then hopefully that leads to further services being added. It's not just maybe relying on that, again, normally heavily subsidised public transport routes. So again, the other kind of element to that is looking at funding and almost like transforming the funding needed to deliver these services. I know the car is a vital part of rural life because it's essential in a lot of areas, but not necessarily you need to have maybe 2 or 3 cars in a household, and that applies equally to urban areas as well as rural areas. If you can have like a 1-car family, I think it is still needed for various reasons, and we could go into that, and that's a whole other session. But if you've got the other options available, then that can be a significant contributor to a reduction in car use and give people the option and the choice. And again, that becomes the leveler. And you're looking at then it's a kind of just type solution. It's sustainable. So again, there's no single solution, but it's the whole range of things. I think MaaS is probably that enabler that can make it happen.
That's great. I mean, Kenny's made an interesting point in the chat that do we need to shift away from this simplified kind of urban versus rural, I guess, categorization almost, and it makes the point, which I wasn't aware of necessarily, that although the Netherlands urban travel data is excellent, as you might expect for the reasons that we mentioned earlier on, that they're just as dependent on us for that kind of rural urban travel and any journeys over the kind of 30 minutes, as he says. So maybe the focus needs to be less on this solution for urban, this solution for rural, and how we combine that and how we also make those urban to rural journeys more, I guess, carbon neutral, I guess, but easier to make at least with the car. Laura, I want to come to you with this because you mentioned briefly in your remarks around the HyTrans project that you guys are involved with. So this is one of the 4 projects funded through the MaaS Investment Fund, of which Enterprise are one of the key partners being led through HyTrans. So clearly that's the Highlands and Islands region. That is a significant and it's a large rural area. So interested to get Enterprise's approach to that and why you think it's important that you guys are involved in these rural projects, if you like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I mentioned on the intro, we're slightly different in that we do have a presence in parts of the UK that a lot of people, a lot of other operators don't necessarily, and we do serve rural communities every day in different ways as well. So we do start from the premise that we serve the entire UK already. So I think it's sometimes a bit easier for us to think about it in terms of not necessarily being urban versus rural, but actually what different areas need, because actually urban versus rural I think is a little bit too simplistic, because you have big urban areas, you have cities like Anna's been talking about. Glasgow is obviously a huge a huge kind of urban area, but actually you have smaller urban areas, smaller towns, and then you have rural areas sort of in between. So you do have a real mixture in the ecosystem. And I think the reason that we're, we're really excited to be part of the Go High project is actually we see maybe a car club or other kinds of shared vehicles as a way of enabling the other modes of transport in that. So in areas where it doesn't make sense to have a bus route, you can use a car club as an alternative to that in that situation. Or for example, areas where actually people can't cycle because of the distances involved, you can use shared vehicles to get to them to the transport hub so they can make the next section of their journey maybe via active travel. So it's about that whole ecosystem. It's how different modes can work together. And obviously the great thing about a MaaS platform is that it brings all those modes together to allow that person to plan their journey as they need it. The other two things I would say about rural transport is I suppose you need to look at where the demand for the services is going to come from to make different services viable. And a couple of the things that we think about is where can you find demand from corporate travel? So who are the big employers in the areas? Are they big public sector employers? Are they big companies? Where can you find the demand, and actually can you work with those companies to make sure they use the platform, they use the MaaS platform themselves for their corporate travel, because that creates additional demand immediately if people are using it for their own work travel. And actually those people would then be more likely to think, oh, I could use that at the weekend as well for personal travel. And then the other demand in a lot of rural areas is tourism, and it might not be all parts of the year, but actually for a lot of areas, some of the biggest congestion problems come at the highest sort of tourism seasons. So making sure that actually you've created a product that can be used and can attract tourists to it can actually create a real demand at the points of the year where you might have the biggest pinch points in terms of congestion, but actually also can add the viability to those services for residents who need them the whole year round as well. So I suppose it is about the whole ecosystem, and then considering the different demand generators that are going to make a service viable so that residents can use it the whole year round.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And I think it's encouraging that of the 4 projects being funded through Scotland's MaaS Investment Fund, that they all have a significant rural element to them. And you mentioned tourism as well, and the MaaS Investment project being led through TACTRAN has a specific focus on services in Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, which is, as you might expect, our national park has a significant tourism element to it. So these are all areas that are being explored through the fund, and we are excited to see how they develop over the coming months. Jenny has just put in the chat, for those of you who don't know Jenny, she runs the SRITC, which focuses very much on rural transport, and they ran a session last week. And part of that was very specifically looking at rural MaaS. So if you weren't part of that meeting, then you will be able to catch up on it. So I would direct you to that for some more kind of in-depth discussion in that particular subject. Anna, Cubic Anna, if I can call you that. If we come to you next, because I wanted to now move on to looking at how MaaS sits with other sort of, I guess, within that toolkit of responses to achieving decarbonisation. And you mentioned that in your opening remarks. And of course, there needs to be a kind of cohesiveness there rather than just a random set of ad hoc initiatives, which ultimately comes down to the policy frameworks being in place. But how do you see MaaS sitting as part of that, and what do you think are the key things that might sit alongside that?
Yeah, sure. So I think MaaS has a really important role to play in connecting all of our journeys, but I think equally important will be having sort of an integrated congestion management or a digital mobility platform. At the moment, a lot of our roads and roadside equipment is managed separately from how our public transport is managed. And that creates a bit of an issue with how we get this situational awareness across our network. If something happens on our roads, it's going to equally impact how our bus servers are traveling. And so until we have the power to create this clear picture of what is happening across the entire network, we're going to struggle to, use these tools to enact policy changes and get that full utilization of our network. So that, I think, is really important. I think intersection management is going to play an important role in, addressing pinch points in our network, reducing idling times for vehicles, and also making, our intersections safer for cyclists and pedestrians. I also think things like road user charging and dynamic pricing, low emission zones are also going to have a really important impact. But you know, we can't do one thing or the other all the time. That's just going to be a technology focused approach, which I think people struggle to get behind. I think this is where that roadmap and strategic procurement is going to be really important, so that we can get to this point where the network is operating, you know, as one, and it's not roads versus public transport versus private operators.
Okay, thanks, Anna. If I could move from one Anna to the other Anna, to Councillor Richardson, because that then sort of brings into, so that's around, you know, cohesive policy and cohesive messaging around that as well. And, you know, from your perspective, what is the responsibility of the city there, of Glasgow there, as opposed to, say, central government? Do you see that as being sort of top down, where you guys can deliver on some of those objectives, or do you think there's a degree of autonomy there for Glasgow to set about what it's trying to achieve?
I think at a city level, the thing that we know better than anyone is what our citizens need, what our city needs, and, you know, we're very much on the ground there. We're managing the roads network, but also we're working very closely with bus operators. We've got our partnerships with Nextbike, for example, and with our car share. So we're very much involved in the sort of nuts and bolts of transport every day, and we're speaking to our people, and we understand all those other issues that we've talked about already today, you know, around inequalities and so on. So we're very much at the heart of that. Certainly, I think cities have the opportunity to move quite quickly on a lot of things. Sometimes we're able to be a little bit more nimble than national government, just because of the way that we're set up. So I think as a lot of cities would still be happy to have more autonomy and to make even more decisions around our transport than we're currently able to. But I think the thing that is really crucial for national government, and something that I'm feeling is coming across ever more strongly, is there has to be that really coherent message. If the Scottish Government aren't speaking about things like reducing vehicle journeys, and they very much are now, it's very hard for us to manage that on the ground. And quite often we're on the front line of taking the flak when it comes to bringing in bold and difficult policy decisions, and having that backup from national government, having that 20% kilometre reduction, for example, in their climate plan, is really going to help us and bolster us and let us move forward. So I think there's a really crucial role for national government, but certainly local government, we're right here on the ground, and we know what we need to do, and we know how we need to do it, and it's just a matter of being able to do that and to get all the partners around the table and to move as quickly as I think we all realise we need to now. Yeah,
thank you, and I'd love to delve more into that, because I think that whole area is probably a session in itself. And indeed, we did have a session on governance where we could dug into some of these roles and responsibilities in a bit more detail. But we're running into the last few minutes now, so I just wanted to get a perspective on you, because I think, although we're nearly an hour and a half in, I think it's only really been mentioned once, which was this word COVID and the potential impact that it's going to have in future, and whether it set us back in terms of our decarbonisation objectives. So I might try and come to each of you on this, if we can keep our answers relatively short. And I guess first question is, do we think that COVID is going to have a significant longer term impact in the way that people consume transport? Or is it seems maybe being a relatively short term blip? And if it is the former, what needs to happen to sort of undo that damage? Is it as simple as a messaging thing? Does the government have to be stronger in how they approach this? You know, public transport was basically made to be the bad guy. I mean, really made to be the bad guy for a long period of time. And how do we begin to make that shift back? So I know it's not an easy one, but so Andy, I'll start with you first, but I'll maybe come to all of you if we've got time.
So thanks, Ali. My quick answer is, I don't think you should. The answer is, will COVID have a long-term effect? Yes, I think it will, because it has forced people to realize that there are alternatives to their traditional model of work. And I very strongly point out, of course, that not everyone goes and sits in an office. But it's not. So I think there's been a negative, which is that people are using cars more now, and that is creating more congestion. But there is a wider cultural piece about the expectation of being in an office 9 to 5 days a week, and I think that has been or is being broken very over the last few months, last 18 months. And I think that actually has a lot of potential benefits as well. So it's not just a downside, there are also upsides to this. And the question is, how do you capture that so you get both the benefit of in-person engagement and social contact, which is critical, but also not feel that everyone has to be going into an office 9 to 5. So.
Thanks, Andy. And Anna, all right, if I can come to you next on that COVID question.
Yeah, I completely agree with Andy's comments. I think there have been negatives in terms of shifting people off public transport and into private vehicles. But I agree there have also been positives. You know, the rise of flexible work has given us a great opportunity to be able to work with the private sector on how we shift the peak, you know, being able to not have everyone trying to do the school rush at the same time or trying to rush to the office at the same time gives us a great opportunity to balance out our network. And equally, there's also been fantastic growth in, you know, pedestrians and active transport that I think, you know, those are the trends we need to look now to encourage going forward. And I think there, you know, this has given us a good opportunity to reflect on how our networks have been working and come back stronger.
And Laura, if I come to you next, I'm interested in the operator's perspective on this, because I presume that you will not have been immune to the last 18 months and what's been there. So what are your views on the next 18 months and then beyond?
Yeah, and I think the central point is, as everyone said, is you know, probably rightly, the government has spent a lot of time telling people not to use shared transport and public transport because of COVID, and it's sometimes quite hard to change the behaviours back from that. But actually, in other ways, it is an opportunity, because people have changed the way that they work, they've changed where they're working, they've changed their sort of schedules. So it is, in other ways, an opportunity to actually think, well, maybe not so many people will be travelling every day from their home into the city centre. Actually, maybe a lot more people will be travelling around the areas that they live, and therefore that does open up a new ecosystem of different opportunities. So it might be that rather than concentrating all the ideas on how to get people into a city centre, it might be about helping people travel around the areas that they live, and that could be suburban areas, it could be further out, but looking at the solutions that actually you know, get you from the home to a place you might need closer to home. And actually that does open up active travel for a lot more people, for example. It also means that a lot less people need that second private car, so they might use shared transport for those journeys when they do need it. And I do think otherwise, generally, a lot of people have realised that their private cars were sat on the driveway, in some cases 2 private cars sat on the driveway for large periods of time without being used, and they maybe started to consider the money that they were spending every month on that asset, and whether actually there was a cheaper way of doing it. So I think there is an opportunity there to really drive investment in the kind of new technologies we'll be talking about today, and use that as a way of changing the transport behaviours the same way people have changed some of their other kind of lifestyle behaviours as well.
Thank you, Laura. I'm really conscious of time, and apologies to the other panelists, because I would have been interested to get their views on that as well. But we are going to run over. We're kind of bang on the half an hour now, so I'm going to have to draw the panel to a close. But many thanks to all of you for your input to today's session. Many thanks to all of you at home, of course, for joining today's session as well. A reminder that this session and all the sessions as part of the MaaS Scotland conference have been recorded and will be available soon on our website. So please do keep an eye out for that. If you want to get in touch with me, then by all means do so, or get on to the MaaS Scotland website to find out some more information. And just finally, I want to thank, you know, not just our panelists today, but all our panelists across the last 4 sessions that we've run, and all of you who have taken the time to join those sessions as well. It is very much appreciated. Online sessions do have their advantage, and it's been good, and we've had lots of international representatives, which is great. Having said that, we are really keen to get back to the face-to-face world of meetings, and with that in mind, the MaaS Scotland conference will return, fingers crossed, in a physical format next June. So keep an eye out for further information on that, but we're looking forward to seeing you all, if not at that event, hopefully at MaaS Scotland events before that, face-to-face, over the next 9 months before we get to that stage. But thank you all again for joining, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ali.